The buzz meter this Sunday, the Jim Comey memos are leaked to the press by Congress, igniting a media debate over whether they help or hurt President Trump.
There's nothing else in there, no red flags, no smoking gun that would incriminate the president.
If you take the Comey memos at their word, they're devastating to President Trump with regard to whether he's telling the truth.
But for him to write these things down, it just seems so self-serving. Yeah. It just seems to me almost as if he was penning the first draft of the book that has now been published.
Was Comey's briefing of Trump about the Steele dossier tied to the leak to CNN, which Comey said needed a news hook to run the story? Journalists start turning on Jim Comey as he peddles his book, now asking questions about his motivation and the tone of his anti-Trump attacks.
It feels like you might have some scores to settle, you know, that you might have a little bit of anger left over and a little bit of bitterness. Would you plead guilty to all that?
Yeah, I wouldn't, actually. I would take that one to trial.
Is it about time that journalists hold the fired FBI chief accountable? Sean Spicer, the former White House spokesman, weighs in on that and other media controversies. A media flap over Nikki Haley being blamed for confusion by Larry Kudlow for going on a Sunday show and announcing more sanctions against Moscow, which turned out to be wrong.
By the way, it's a completely sexist remark. She must have been a little confused. Brother, please, confused?
They really hung her out to dry on background at first, saying, she got a little ahead of herself.
Is the administration sending mixed messages on foreign policy, or are their pundits just playing up a soap opera? Sean Hannity under a high-decibel media assault over his friendship with the president's personal lawyer.
NBC News has confirmed inside that courtroom that the third client, Michael Cohen's third client, is Sean Hannity.
It was revealed to be Sean Hannity, clearly a bombshell here in court.
I'm not surprised that the media is going after me. It's predictable. It's pathetic. Now, here's the truth. The media is guilty of every single solitary thing they have been accusing me of over the last 24 hours. The media is the sewer.
We'll look at how much of the criticism is fair and how much unfair. Plus, some final thoughts on Barbara Bush, who had a knack for making news. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. We'll get to the new memos in just a moment, but first, James Comey stands to make a fortune on his book. But once his TV tour got underway and journalists saw the tone of his attacks on President Trump, what was envisioned as a love fest turned surprisingly critical.
I mean, including calling his skin orange and saying his looked like he had tanning goggles. And, you know, some people said that was kind of, for lack of a better word, that was a little catty. Did you enjoy taking those shots at the president?
No, I didn't think of them as shots, and I still don't. No, my only regret is that those folks likely haven't read the book.
But isn't that construct unfair to President Trump in a way? Because the question was if President Trump was compromised by the Russians. You say it's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. I mean, it's possible there's life on other planets.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. Susan Ferricchio, chief congressional correspondent for The Washington Examiner. And Marie Harf, a Fox News analyst and former CIA and State Department spokeswoman. Molly, the media narrative was that Jim Comey was a truth-telling hero. And then he started peddling his book. What changed?
Well, I think that there was no way for the media to be as positive toward James Comey as they were at the time of his firing. So part of it is just about having a more natural reaction to what he wrote. I think people were really hoping that this book would have a lot of new details or that it would fuel the fire against Trump. And it didn't have those things. And because he was so personal and petty, he wrote a book on leadership, but he kind of seems adrift. I think the reporters are just responding to what was in the book.
Would you agree, Marie, that some journalists at least are starting to challenge him and his tone in the ways that we haven't seen in the past?
I think that's true. And, you know, Jim Comey is not really liked by Democrats or Republicans at this point. And I think reporters were trying to respond to the book. And what's been interesting is over the week of the book tour now, news has been made every day. And so reporters are sort of having to ask him about that. And I actually think that's been pretty interesting.
And we will get to that.
Exactly.
You know, I went on the air Monday morning after that Stephanopoulos interview and said Comey was hurting himself with the tone and the petty pettiness, really, of his attacks. New York Times next morning, James Comey's attacks on Trump may hurt a carefully cultivated image. So, Susan, let me put up the presidential tweet on the screen, one of many about Comey. So, General Michael Flynn's life can be totally destroyed, says the president, while shady James Comey can leak and lie, make lots of money from a third-rate book that never should have been written. Okay, but didn't Michael Flynn plead guilty to lying to the FBI?
Well, he did. I think, what the reporters are actually angry about is that the book did not have a smoking gun, and they were expecting one. And so they were
We knew most of the revelations from his testimony and so on.
Just about all of it. It had nothing in there that I think they had hoped to see that would move the narrative along about Russia collusion. There was no there. And I think what you saw this week was the frustration being borne out by the press when they interviewed Comey. Where are the goods, they were saying.
A little bit of a postpartum depression. So, Molly, this is why people hate giving documents to Congress. This stuff leaked in an hour for the AP and then others. But in one memo, Comey says he told Trump that he was briefing him on the dossier's sexual allegations because, let me just read this, the media, CNN in particular, was telling us they were about to run with it but needed a news hook. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think, it's interesting. People say there was nothing in these memos. Well, the fact that there was nothing in these memos is actually the most important thing because they were selectively leaked to launch a special counsel. So that there was nothing in there to justify the special counsel is huge news, actually. But even that first memo where he explains why he briefed him only on the salacious part of the dossier and says it's because CNN was looking for a hook to justify writing about it. The hook, if you remember, that story that got everything going was that Comey had briefed Donald Trump. So he says he's telling him about this because CNN is about to do this and that they're going to keep it very close to the chest. Instead, this meeting became the hook to justify putting the dossier into the bloodstream. And also, he was not telling the truth about how closely held this information was, which makes all this other information about Trump asking for loyalty look totally different when you realize Trump realized pretty early on that his intelligence chiefs were leaking against him.
Well, but Comey's acknowledged some leaks, but Comey doesn't control what CNN does.
That's
and
right.
In fact, CNN, which held back the actual dossier, unlike BuzzFeed, but reported on the existence of this briefing, can we completely blame that on Comey, or wouldn't that have come out anyway?
Absolutely. A number of media outlets leading up to the election and after had this dossier. And BuzzFeed did put the whole thing out there. CNN didn't.
Right, and the reason none of these organizations went with it is because it's unsubstantiated allegations and not just in the sexual
Exactly. And I would push back on Molly a little bit. Comey briefed Donald Trump at the end of a long briefing about Russian interference in the election. So all the intel chiefs went up to tell Donald Trump what their assessment had been. At the end, I think Jim Comey felt like the president had a right to know that reporters had a dossier. One of the most interesting things in the Comey memos is that parts of that dossier, not the salacious sexual parts, but other parts had been verified by U.S. intelligence.
Yes.
This was
something
something the incoming president had a right to know.
That's actually, there are things in the dossier that are just public information, like Russia is a country or Russia tries to meddle, and that is well known. What was interesting about these memos, Comey says that James Clapper told him to do this briefing. And James Clapper is an interesting name as well. That's the former director of national intelligence.
For Obama.
Because in a recent report from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, finding number 44 was that James Clapper gave very inconsistent testimony about his leaks to CNN, or his conversations with CNN, and he now works for CNN. That this dossier briefing occurred, and 4 days later it was put out on CNN. That is very interesting. They did have high-level sources,
Reporters had
and
had this for months, Molly.
and they needed. And as James Comey
I know
said,
for a fact.
as James Comey said, CNN said they needed a justification to put it out.
I got to jump in. I know Molly gets to finding 44 because she does her homework. Another thing in the Comey memos that struck me, Susan, is Comey was talking to the president, he says, about stopping leaks. Trump replied, let's put it up on the screen, that we need to go after the reporters and referred to the fact that 10 or 15 years ago we put them in jail to find out what they know, and it worked. He mentioned Judy Miller, now at Fox, by name. They spent a couple days in jail, make a new friend, and they're ready to talk. Does that concern you?
Judy Miller was in jail for 3 months. And this is nothing new. Reporters get threatened with jail time.
Investigation.
She wouldn't reveal her
sources,
which is exactly what Trump is talking about. It's happened before. The threats are ongoing against reporters. What would be different this time if Trump did it is that it would get a lot more attention and focus and a lot more anger from the public because it would be Donald Trump doing it, and people already believe he's waging war on the free press, even though President Obama spied on reporters regularly and subpoenaed their phone records. No one seemed to care about it then. And
I think a lot of people cared about it then.
Well, not the way they would if
Yeah.
President Trump were to do this. It's frightening to hear a president talk about jailing a reporter. And granted, he's frustrated with the leaks and they were chuckling over it. It was a joke. We don't know. But it's happened before. It's part of our history here in America. I wouldn't rule it out happening in the future.
All right, we're running a little short on time, so let me ask you to keep that in mind. Comey's book tour, I think, it was also marred by the news that the Justice Department has referred for criminal prosecution in the case of Andrew McCabe, his former deputy, for lying about leaks, ironically enough. Actually, we just learned about this, but it had taken place some weeks ago.
Yeah, he was referred for criminal prosecution for lying about just one of the many leaks that have come out of the FBI. You wrote about another leak he was involved in during the Trump administration.
Suspected of by Reince Priebus, yeah.
Sure. This is a great example, though, of how the media have missed a really important story about leaks to journalists. Now, it's fine for journalists to take leaks, or you can argue that that's fine and that they should not be persecuted. But the lack of security of information is a huge story, and the media have been so focused on this Russia conspiracy theory that they've missed a really big story about people undermining a administration through leaks, and they missed this Andrew McCabe story.
They haven't missed it. They've completely ignored it. Everybody talks about it. Nobody writes about it. Go try to find reporting on it. It just is ignored.
And even a criminal
because they
prosecution
love
doesn't make
the
the
leaks,
front.
and they need the leaks, and that is what keeps the press
Hold on for a
going
second.
right now.
What about this Bloomberg story that says that sources say that Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, told the president he's not a target of the Mueller investigation? Do you think that deserved more coverage? Or did we already know that because of a Washington Post story a couple of weeks ago saying Trump's legal team has been told the president is not a target?
Well, I think it definitely deserved more coverage. But, you know, the fact is there's so much going on with these cross investigations and governments investigate. I think the public now is perfectly understandably confused about what's going on.
A lot of people too, not even journalists, have a hard time. But so just to close up on Comey, it seems to me that here's a guy who, when he ran the FBI, infuriated Democrats for reopening the probe of Hillary Clinton at the end of the election, infuriated Republicans for not bringing charges. And now it seems to me he's trying to say, well, it would have been better if Hillary Clinton had won and we should vote against Donald Trump. So you kind of alluded to this earlier, both liberal commentators and conservative commentators, many of them have no use for this guy.
Absolutely, and I would venture to guess in a week or two, he's not going to be in the top 20 stories we're talking about. He is not the focus. You know, he's not at the center of the Mueller investigation. He's only a small part of it. This is an interesting book tour that I don't think has gone as well for him as he would have predicted. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much.
Right. By the way, the president taking issue with a New York Times story by reporter Maggie Haberman about Michael Cohen, his personal lawyer, being on investigation, which says that Trump hasn't always treated Cohen well throughout their long association. Cohen's a real loyalist. So here's the tweet. The New York Times and a third-rate reporter named Maggie Haberman, known as a crooked H flunky, who I don't speak to and nothing to do with, and he goes on to criticize the story. Well, Maggie Haberman has interviewed Trump many times, including several times as president, and one of her colleagues at the Times tweeted this picture of the two of them in the Oval Office. So apparently he does have something to do with Maggie Haberman, who, by the way, shared in a Pulitzer Prize this week. When we come back, the flap over Nikki Haley and Russian sanctions, has the press turned that into something of a soap opera? And later, Sean Spicer on the president's war of words with Comey, with the FBI, and with the media. It was on last Sunday's Face the Nation that UN Ambassador Nikki Haley essentially announced tough action against Russia in the wake of the U.S. airstrikes.
So you will see that Russian sanctions will be coming down. Secretary Mnuchin will be announcing those on Monday if he hasn't already.
Those airstrikes, of course, against Syria, but it turned out the president was not approving new sanctions against Moscow, and his new economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, tried to explain the Haley snafu.
She got ahead of the curve. She's done a great job. She's a very effective ambassador. There might have been some momentary confusion about that.
The ambassador offered a rather sharp response to Fox's Dana Perino.
I was able to get in touch with Nikki Haley, and she said, quote, "With all due respect, I don't get confused."
Molly Hemingway, the press is kind of playing this as a personality infighting. Is it that? Is it overplayed? Or is it raised serious questions about how the White House handles foreign policy?
I think it's very serious, but at the same time, the way that they described what Larry Kudlow said, I think was unfair to him. By definition, she did get ahead of the curve because she announced sanctions that didn't take place.
But the question is whether it was her fault.
He didn't say that she was confused. He said there was some momentary confusion. I think he was poorly served by the way people reported on it. But it absolutely is true that the policy obviously changed at some point. She did announce something that didn't happen. Right. So there's something newsworthy. I wish we could be more substantive about what happened there, as opposed to just make it about a war between Kudlow and...
Exactly. I mean, it seems to me that Nikki Haley was sent out with inaccurate or outdated information, but you worked at State. I mean, not unprecedented for you, an ambassador, to go on a Sunday show with an announcement that hasn't been fully vetted by the White House.
Well, the reporting, though, showed that it had been vetted by the national security team, including at the White House, that it was after President Trump saw her appearance on the Sunday show that he said, wait a second, I don't actually want to do these sanctions. The policy changed in the next 24 hours. Right. We often talk about reporters who report on palace intrigue anonymously. This was one that spilled out very publicly and on the record. Kudlow had to apologize to her. But I think Molly's right. Substantively, it is more important that the president declined to put additional sanctions on Russia, even though clearly there had been, according to reporting, a decision made to do so.
Right. There was, of course, the Susan Rice incident in your administration, which we won't relitigate now. But the New York Times...
There were so many, Howie.
There were so many. New York Times called this a remarkable display of discord involving larger questions of political ambition, jealousy, resentment, and loyalty. Now, the president talked about his whole policy toward Russia and the media news conference. Let's take a quick look.
There has been nobody tougher than me. With the media, no matter what I did, it's never tough enough because that's their narrative.
Well, all true. He's right.
Well, I think the president certainly has a point about the media narrative is no matter what he does on Russia, but you're saying it's all true that this is the toughest president in history when it comes to Russia. I mean, Ronald Reagan and the evil empire.
Right. Well, he's been tough enough to not warrant the kind of criticism he's getting from the media. And that's the way I interpreted what he said, that they are being unfairly critical of the way he has responded to Russia because it's about the narrative of Trump and Russia collusion. And that has sort of thrown a shadow over, I think, some fairly tough policies against Russia since he's taken office. And I don't, you know...
Whether you focus on the president's words, he usually speaks positively about Putin, or the actions you want to get into.
And people really are upset that he doesn't speak against the humanitarian abuses in Russia. But when you look at, he supported NATO expansion. He made NATO countries increase their defenses against Russia. He did missile defense in Poland. He's bombing Syria quite a bit. He attacked Russian mercenaries.
But he took steps to avoid Russians when he bombed Syria.
And there were, no, actually, there was a pretty brutal attack
because he was trying to avoid Russia. He was trying to avoid World War III. I mean, you know.
Avoiding World War III, I think, is a good thing. Let me just get a last question to Marie, former State Department spokeswoman. Big headlines now about Kim Jong-un halting nuclear testing. There's some debate about how significant that is. But the press portrayed Donald Trump as a dangerous hothead when he was taunting Little Rocket Man and so forth. He pulls off this secret Mike Pompeo mission to meet with Kim Jong-un until the Washington Post wrote story. Does he now deserve some credit, at least for what's happened so far?
Well, we'll see what comes out of this meeting, right? And we'll see if Mike Pompeo gets confirmed. I think that one of the reasons they leaked the Pompeo-North Korea meeting was to push his confirmation forward because they have been worried about getting the votes.
Brief comment. Sure, we'll see what happens. There may be no deal with North Korea. May not even be a meeting, but is the press giving Trump any credit for the recent developments?
You know, there's no question that this is so much different than what we saw from any of the previous 4 administrations. It is a tremendous feat. Much remains to be seen, and people need to be careful. But I don't think he's getting the credit. And particularly,
what has he done?
Oh goodness, there has been so much done. There's been so much done just to get to this point, even that we're at these high-level talks, which we haven't had since Matt O'Neill.
Got to wrap it up. Molly Hemingway, Susan Frischio, Marie Harf, great to see you all this Sunday.
Howie.
Ahead, Sean Spicer weighs in on a pretty wide range of media controversies. But up next, Sean Hannity punching back after a sustained media assault about his friendship with the president's personal lawyer after that emerged in court. Is the criticism fair? That's next. The media went absolutely haywire after a New York court hearing in the suit involving Stormy Daniels and the president's personal lawyer. The judge forced Michael Cohen to reveal the name of a client he had refused to make public, and it was Sean Hannity. The Fox News host quickly insisted that wasn't right.
Here's the truth. Michael Cohen never represented me in any legal matter. I never retained his services. I never received an invoice. I never paid Michael Cohen for legal fees. I did have occasional brief conversations with Michael Cohen.
Liberal lawyer Alan Dershowitz challenged Hannity on his own program.
I do want to say that I really think that you should have disclosed your relationship with Cohen when you talked about him on this show.
It was such a minor relationship in terms of, and it had to do with real estate and nothing political.
The network issued a statement saying while Fox News was unaware of Sean Hannity's informal relationship with Michael Cohen and was surprised by the announcement in court yesterday, we have reviewed the matter and spoken to Sean, and he continues to have our full support. Joining us now from New York is Shelby Holliday, senior video reporter for The Wall Street Journal. And you heard Hannity say he wasn't a client, but just a longtime friend of Michael Cohen, had occasional legal conversations, didn't pay him, and therefore no need to disclose that to his viewers. What's your take?
Well, it appears he did have an attorney-client relationship with Michael Cohen because in court, Michael Cohen sought to shield his communications with Hannity. So legally, you can have a discussion about civil liberties and debate whether or not Sean Hannity's name should have been revealed. But the reason this was a huge media story is, number one, there was the drama of Michael Cohen's third mystery client, Sean Hannity, being revealed in open court. That automatically created some buzz. Number two, there are political reasons. This gave Hannity's political foes an easy opportunity to go out and throw some punches. But number three, the big reason, and this is something that applies to the viewers, is the ethical and legal questions surrounding why Hannity didn't reveal his attorney-client relationship with Michael Cohen.
Well,
he's been covering the raid on Michael Cohen's office and hotel room. He's been criticizing it. And Alan Dershowitz, as Alan Dershowitz said, it would have just been easy to say, hey, I've got some legal advice from Michael Cohen, and we have this attorney-client relationship.
Right. Well, whether it's attorney-client or not, on that point, I wrote in my Fox News column that Hannity should have disclosed it, especially because he was highly critical of what FBI did to Cohen in raiding his home and his office and his hotel room. And last year, Michael Cohen was a guest on Hannity's radio show, and Hannity said, full disclosure, we're longtime friends. That would have, in my view at least, solved the problem.
Well, and I also think it's worth pointing out that Hannity does have relationships with other lawyers representing Trump, and he has disclosed those. So in a way, he has set precedent for himself to be transparent with his viewers. Right. And that just raises more questions about why he didn't say something about Michael Cohen.
Well, I think some of those other lawyers Hannity was friends with long before they had any particular relationship with Donald Trump.
True.
But in the aftermath, and there was such an intense media reaction to this, a couple of people went on the air on other cable news channels and kind of just got out there. Let's take a look.
The question now lingers for everybody else. Well, what has Hannity been involved in? Is he paying off women as well?
What was it that he was doing for Sean Hannity? Was he paying off a woman for harassment in the workplace?
So how can professional commentators go on the air without a shred of evidence and speculate right after this happened that, oh, there must have been a woman involved or something, when there is absolutely no evidence to support that?
Right. Journalistically, that's out of bounds. No reporters or news people should be speculating like that. Like, as you said, there's no shred of evidence, and people around here who know Sean Hannity say he doesn't have that reputation. This is not him. However, I would point out that those people you just showed are opinion writers and opinion show hosts, much like Sean Hannity.
They can criticize him all they want, but you can't make stuff up and speculate. Now, you touched on this earlier. I wrote in my column, look, Sean Hannity is paid for his opinions, and he's a fierce defender of President Trump. He's had dinner with him. He's hung out at Mar-a-Lago. He's interviewed him. When people tune in at 9 p.m. Eastern, they know what they're getting as a commentator guy. Do you think?
And the president tells them to tune in.
And the president has obviously kind of endorsed his show on Twitter. Do you think, given what was initially wall-to-wall coverage on CNN and MSNBC, that there was rival networks or rival commentators taking an opportunity to go after a guy who not only works at Fox but is not very well liked by liberals?
I think, yes, absolutely. In some cases, this was, for example, opinion shows at night. They, it seemed to enjoy taking some swings at Hannity. However, I would also note that Hannity may have fueled some of this himself, because instead of going on his program the night that this was all disclosed and saying to viewers, should have revealed this, or I'm sorry, he went out and attacked the media for covering this story, calling the media fake news, partisan hacks with zero credibility. And as one Hannity viewer pointed out to me, that was an interesting way of addressing an issue in which a self-proclaimed partisan talk show host had essentially undermined his own credibility on the Cohen issue.
Well, as somebody who was critical, I'll just say, but Hannity also is entitled to defend himself. Shelby Holliday.
Absolutely, and he is an opinion host, as you point out, Howie.
Thanks very much. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Ahead, the coverage of the president breaking his silence by calling Stormy Daniels a liar. But first, Sean Spicer on the president's complaint about the media's narrative about him and Russia.
I
I've seen it all. I've seen politics and government from the inside, and I can see what's wrong with it and what's broken and what needs to be changed.
Wherever I smell hypocrisy, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, I will go after them.
We don't have time to dance around the issue. I like to get right to the point. I just come at the news with a different viewpoint.
My job is getting to the bottom line of what is the American people's truth.
President Trump's relations with the media have gotten even more hostile, in my view, since Sean Spicer worked in the White House. I sat down with the former press secretary here in Studio One. Sean Spicer, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Jim Comey has taken plenty of hits on this book tour for the tone of his attacks on Donald Trump. Do you think the press is now holding him accountable?
To some degree. I think if you look at what probably they thought this book tour was going to look like versus what it has looked like, there's a big difference. Comey went into this, I think, largely with an image of the Boy Scout, the guy that was loyal, and now there's a lot of
truth teller.
Right, and I think there's definitely now a lot more questions than there were when he came in about how he handled his job and sort of that degree of loyalty that he proclaims. That's awful different, though. Remember, the goal is to somewhat sell books, and the other goal is to come out with a different image, I think. So I don't know where that balance is.
On selling books
That's
than
right.
the other. But no, in one of the memos that was disclosed the other day, he talked about how CNN had the dossier, the unverified Steele dossier, but needed a news hook to run it. Now, you're taking issue with CNN's original story on the dossier and what Comey said to the president about it and how CNN handled it. Explain.
Well, all I was getting at the time on that January 11th when we first ordered, and now, is that the peg that CNN had was that said that he had been, the president-elect had been shown that this so-called summary of the dossier. My recollection is that never occurred, and it wasn't that Comey hadn't briefed him. I was in the room. I was there. I'm well aware of what actually happened. But where they were hanging their hat was that this summary had been shown to him. In fact, Comey, by his own admission, seems to admit that he had briefed him on one allegation in that, and then that's where it centered around.
The sexual allegation. I've talked to CNN. CNN's position is that both things can be true, that Comey did verbally brief the president-elect, and also that this two-page summary was given to both President Obama and President-elect Trump. All right, so the president hasn't exactly been an idle bystander here. You're familiar with that. He's called Comey things like an untruthful slime ball. If you were in the White House, would you advise him to use that kind of language?
Look, I think the president has spent the last couple of years effectively branding people, and he's marketing a genius when it comes to a lot of this stuff. So I don't know that he's going to take a ton of my advice. His style's not always been my style, but he's been fairly effective using his style.
Marketing genius, that is a diplomatic answer. So on another subject, the president proclaimed that the media aren't giving him enough credit for the way he deals with Russia because he says it doesn't fit the media narrative. He also said at a press conference, no one's been tougher on Russia than I've been. I don't think even you would say that from the podium.
Well, I think if you talk about the number of diplomats that have been expelled, thank you, and the sanctions that have gone on Russia, it's been very tough. I think that's in sharp contrast to the narrative that exists, that he's somehow trying to benefit from Russia, that there's this behind-the-scenes back channel. The president's been very clear from the beginning that whether it's Russia or any other country that we have an economic or national security interest in, it's in our country's best interest to have a healthy relationship with those countries. But he's not going to do it to forsake either our national or economic security.
Right. If you look at the administration's record, there have been some of the actions that you described. The press focuses more on his rhetoric, which is friendly toward Putin.
Sure, but remember, it was also Obama who was on stage with the prime minister at the time that says, I will get that, I will convey that to Vladimir, and we will have a better working relationship after the thing. Yeah. You had Hillary Clinton, I mean, to the degree to which those prior leaders on the Democratic Party had actually tried to reset relations with Russia, had tried to back-channel things to Russia. In fact, there's no evidence that has actually occurred on this side with President Trump, and yet he's getting much more criticism than they ever did.
That communication screw-up with Nikki Haley going on a Sunday show and announcing there will be more sanctions against Moscow the next day, a lot of finger-pointing over the fact that there were no sanctions announced. Does that remind you of the kind of problems that you or any press secretary faced in terms of getting everyone on the same page with the president's message?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that when you have a big decision coming down, there's a lot of parties involved. In this case, you've got probably, Ambassador Haley, you've got the folks at the State Department, the National Security, Defense Department, Treasury, all of these entities, and there's a lot of discussions going back and forth. Sometimes there are decisions that are made at the staff level that haven't been signed off by the president. And again, there's a miscommunication at some point. Someone got ahead of it, a decision, or a decision was made that was changed.
Well, Haley said she didn't get ahead of it. She was operating on the information that she had.
Right, and it's very possible that at that time, the senior staff, by that I mean at the cabinet secretary level, had made a decision, and they either thought that the president had signed off or he did and he changed. I mean, there's a variety of things that could have happened, but I don't think that this is the end of the world. It happens a lot. I mean, you look at the Clinton administration, they sent people out on the Sunday show to talk about a video causing Benghazi when in fact that was patently false.
But that was a huge story.
No, but
and
it's
rightly so.
It was, but it's probably in comparison to the coverage. And yet this was merely just a question of timing that was coming out. There were no lives lost.
Just briefly, just briefly, enormous media attention now and speculation about the case against Michael Cohen, the Stormy Daniels lawsuit, whether Cohen's going to flip. What do you make of just the sheer volume of the coverage of those subjects?
I think it's unprecedented, and I think it's also what I find fascinating when I watch news these days, which I try to watch less and less. It seems to be more speculative. If he does this, if they do that, we hear that this might happen.
He fires this one,
and again, none of it's based on fact. It's just a lot of speculation. For now, we haven't seen anything. If someone did something outside the scope of their relationship to Donald Trump in some way, that doesn't make the president complicit in anything.
There has not been a White House communications director since Hope Hicks left, a job you briefly held. Will there be one?
You know, I don't know, and I don't know that it matters.
There's a lot. The president doesn't have a communications director?
He kind of does, though. He's got a very talented team over there. Right. Mercedes Schlapp, Kelly Conway.
Is he his own communications director?
He is in a lot of ways, and I think that the idea of looking at the structure in a very traditional sense went out the window with the president coming in. He's got very talented staff that are performing these very same functions. They just may not have the same titles and sit in the same offices, but they are very, very talented women over there running the shop.
Sean Spicer finally able to watch less news. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Coming up, we'll get an opposing view from longtime Hillary Clinton advisor Philippe Reines. And later, a former Playboy model settles with a tabloid company that bought her story and buried it. Well, we just heard from Sean Spicer. Joining us now with another perspective is Philippe Reines, a former State Department official and longtime advisor to Hillary Clinton. Let's start with Jim Comey. The press loved this guy when he got fired and turned against Donald Trump. Now he's getting scuffed up quite a bit. Is the media criticism more in line with how Hillary people view Comey?
Well, I mean, I think Comey is a difficult character. He's showing a weird combination of someone with very bad judgment, but with a very good memory. And I think people are using him for what they want to use him for, and he has a certain sanctimonious, shucks air about him.
So you're saying the press is cherry picking? If he goes after Trump, then you liberals like it?
I think he's frankly being dissected left and right. I think a lot of his non-answers are being dissected, and frankly, he's not being pressed hard enough on some of his non-answers, like why he didn't trust Sally Yates, that kind of thing.
Right. We talked earlier in the show about how the press has made a very big story out of Nikki Haley going on CBS on last Sunday morning and pretty much announcing new Russian sanctions that the president had not decided on. Did that deserve to be a big story? Because didn't these snafus happen in the Clinton administration?
Well, I think
Obama administration.
I think my opinion is secondary to Nikki Haley's opinion. I mean, Nikki Haley clearly thought it was a big story when she was told that she was confused and had to make it very clear to the White House.
You're sitting there in the seat, so I'd like your opinion.
Well, so I don't think it was overdone, because I remember vividly what you were talking to Sean about when Susan Rice went on the Sunday shows, and it was all hell broke loose. And I understand that people believe that she was being misleading, she was doing this and that, but as a pure factual matter, the world blew up at her, and she was called out for it, and it makes sense.